Hey guys, what's going on? Jacob here. So last week we went over HTML and how to create a web page. Now we're going to go in and style that page, and we're going to do that with CSS. So let's get started. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets and essentially lays out the design for the page. Everything from fonts to colors to sizes to borders to even cool transitions is controlled by CSS, or at least it should be. If it looks good on the page, it's typically CSS that's doing the work. At its core, CSS is just a bunch of selectors and rules. Selectors are how the CSS knows where to apply the rules that are coming. Selectors can be HTML elements like h1 tags or p tags or div tags, or they can be classes or IDs of specific elements on the page. To select an element by ID, you'll use the hash symbol and then the ID name, and to select elements by class, you use the period, then the class name. Then inside the curly brackets will go the rules for the element. This is where you'll define the colors, the background colors, the size, the fonts, and other attributes. Colors are fairly simple. To set the color of text, use the color rule, and to set the background color, use the background color attribute. But where it gets tricky is how to define the colors that will be used. You can use color names like red, blue, green, yellow, etc. But it's much more common to use the hexadecimal number to define the color. I've included links down below on how to find the hexadecimal number for a specific color that you're looking for. And to set this color as the background color or the color of the text for a specific element, you just put the hash symbol and then the rest of the number. You can also use the RGB or RGBA values for color. This controls the level of red, green, and blue light, as well as the opacity. Another common use of CSS is to define fonts. To set the font for text, you'll use the font family rule. Then you can enter in the font or fonts that you want to be used. If you list out more than one font, the browser will go through the list of fonts and find the first one that it can work with. There are a number of web-safe fonts that you can use, like Arial, Times New Roman, Georgia, Helvetica, and this means you don't have to worry about how that font's going to look between browsers or even operating systems. But if you want more creative fonts, then you might want to try using Google Fonts. You can go there, grab the HTML that you need to put in your head section of your page, as well as the CSS that you're going to need to be able to call that font. It limits the stress on your site because you're not having to load fonts. You also don't have to worry about how it's going to show up between browsers and operating systems. With fonts, you can also use font weight, which you can use to describe how thin or thick the font should be. Font size to describe how big the font needs to be for the text. Font style to describe what the style of the text should be. And text transform, which you can use to set the text to be all uppercase or all lowercase. I already touched on this a bit before with background color, but you can also set a background image for an element. To do this, you'll use the background rule and the URL function. Like in HTML, the URL function accepts either absolute or relative links. You can also set the background image to either repeat or not, or to move it up, down, left, or right. And you can also add borders to your elements. To do this, you'll use the border rule. This rule accepts the size of the border, whether the border is solid, dashed, or dotted, and the color of the border. You can also set up different borders for the different sides of the element. You do this by using border top, border bottom, border right, and border left, and they accept the same things as the border attribute. In addition to your normal elements, you can also select pseudo elements as well. These aren't necessarily elements that you can see in the HTML, but you can still apply styles to them via CSS. To select the pseudo element, place a colon after the element you want, and then place one of the following. Hover to add rules whenever a user hovers over the element. Focus to add styles whenever a user clicks on an element. Visited to add rules when a user has come back to the page and sees a link that they have already visited. Before to add something before an element, and after to add something after an element. You can also use nth element to select a certain element or set of elements, like even and odd table rows. I have a link below to W3 School's section on the nth child selectors. Now comes the fun part of linking your styles to the page. First off, create your styles in a CSS file. Then upload that file to a CSS directory on your site, and then link to that file using the link tag in the head section of your page. This tag comes with 3 attributes for you to use. First, the rel or relationship attribute describes the relationship between that file and the page. The type attribute describes what type of file this is. And finally, the href attribute is where you'll put the link to the style sheet. Again, this can either be absolute or relative. Do note that if you have multiple style sheets, the files called later will be used in any conflict situation. And the same goes if you call the same element twice in a CSS file. The later one takes precedence, hence the name Cascading Style Sheets. I mentioned in the HTML videos that HTML should just be for content and CSS just for design. But sometimes you need to add styles in the HTML itself. And to do that, you use the style attribute for any element that you want to affect. You can still use the same rules as you would in CSS. It's just you're not using the selector. Well, that's all for today. Next time we'll get into even more advanced CSS, like creating page layouts. In the meantime, if you have any questions about what I went over today, please leave them in the comments down below and I'll do my best to answer them. But until next time, good luck and happy coding.